very, very inspirational. I'm Donald, grateful member of Al-Anon, some 20, 25 years, I'm not sure exactly what, and I've been asked to share with you my story. So I'm going to start back in 1948. I was born. 11 months later, I contracted a virus, a high fever. It turned out I had polio. The next 2.5 years, I was in a hospital about 50 miles away from where we lived. This is back on Long Island. I'm known, I think, and respected about having a pretty good attitude about things. And when I share in group about that, I say I take no credit for that. And I was thinking in preparation for talking today that part of what that's all about, I believe, is that I have a great faith in my higher power that I'm here, I was born, I grew up, I'm here for some reason. And events that happened and continue to happen in my life that I had, no say in the matter. It wasn't based on a decision I made. It just occurred. One, getting polio at 11 months. I was just taking my first steps, apparently. Obviously, I don't remember. And there was a reason for that. Sometimes I think I get what the reason is, sometimes I don't, But I know that in my family, and a little bit of history very quickly, I was born to an intact family, no major crises, there was no alcoholism or drug addiction, anything like that. I had a father who was a successful businessman and conducted business at home like he did at his job, I guess you might say. And he was tough. He was tough. It took me a long time before I developed a positive relationship with him. My mother, on the other hand, was just one of the most wonderful, sweet, caring, easy people to be with. So I'm in the hospital now from 11 months to about 3.5 years of age, 50 miles away from where we live. And every weekend, my parents would load up, I didn't mention, 3 siblings, 3 older brothers at the time, and load up the station wagon and drive out to Port Jefferson to St. Charles Hospital and visit me. And one of the brothers, it's controversial about which one it was, would get car sick. So I'm like, oh man. And again, I became aware of this obviously later on, but what that must have been like, and what it must have been like, again, my father was kind of tough, didn't show his emotions readily, but my mom, no. And what it was like for her to, have 3 boys, then I was the 4th, and to be in the hospital for 2.5 years, to be in an iron lung for about a year. And what a remarkable woman she is. When I was discharged, it was a Catholic hospital, and the nuns told my parents, told my mother, don't treat Donnie. I was Donnie back in those days. Now I'm Donald. I don't know. But anyway, don't treat Donnie any differently than his 3 older brothers. And one of my favorite stories is I'm 6, 7 years old, and I'm about 30 feet up a maple tree on our front lawn. My mother comes out, and I go, Mommy, look at me. And she goes, good boy, Donnie, good boy. I can imagine what she was feeling behind that good boy stuff. So I was raised with a good attitude. I can say with a lot of assurance that I never felt sorry for myself. Like, why me? It was just, it happened. It happened for a reason. At that point, I wasn't thinking about that, but I can get into that in a little bit. But basically, at that point in time, I would get up in the morning, I would put my brace on here over my right leg and get dressed and said, what are we doing? I could do everything everybody else could do, except I wouldn't challenge them to a race. I played baseball, I played football, I swam, I rode a bike. So it really didn't impact, having polio really didn't impact on me all that much. And in fact, I think when I compare myself to my older brothers, that it gave me a gift of patience, of understanding, a more laid-back personality than my older brothers had. They got into a bunch of trouble growing up in their teenage years. I did not. Not that I was perfect, but... and one of the things to go along with what I'm talking about now is... excuse me. Part of my rehabbing, I guess, was, and I can't remember specific reasons, but I would go back to the hospital every 3 months, and then every 6 months, and that kind of thing, until I reached my maturity, 18, 19 growth, and that kind of a thing. And in the hospital, there was a macrame saying that was framed, and I'll never forget it. And it said, I used to feel sorry for myself for not having any shoes until I met a man without any feet. And I don't think there's too many things more powerful than that. And I was fortunate enough to be able to, that makes sense to me. It's not so bad off. So, coincidentally, there aren't any coincidences. So, sticking on this polio thing for a minute, when I was 18, thank you so much, yeah. Cheers. When I was 18, I got a summer job, and my parents had purchased a house farther out on Long Island. It was 10 miles away from St. Charles Hospital. Anyway, I got this job, and I was fired the first day. And it was a misunderstanding. I didn't do anything wrong, but I was out of work. And anybody can recall back in those days, and I guess these days too, if you didn't get a summer job ahead of time, you're not going to get one the first day of summer. So I said, let me volunteer at St. Charles Hospital. I have a little bit of musical talent. I play the piano, I play guitar. And I said, let me go into the pediatric ward and entertain the kids that are in the hospital there. And I'd go in a couple of times a week. And it worked out really well. 2 quick stories. One, a young man named Billy Vengen, I still remember his name, 13 years old, polio, paralyzed from the neck down. Can you imagine that? He could wiggle one of his fingers a little bit, and that was it. He had a great attitude. He ran the pediatric ward. He was like the boss of all the other kids there. So that was, that was just right in my face. Look, this is, make the best of what you can with what you have. The other thing, and I've shared this in my group, so some of you have heard this already. One day I was outside with about 5 of the kids playing the guitar. Old MacDonald had a farm, and we had 5 different farm animals with the kids. And one of the parents of one of these kids came up to me and says, we want to thank you, Donald, for saving our son's life. And I'm like, what? What did I do? St. Charles, when I went there, was a polio, focused on polio victims. Now, 20 years later, they did burn victims. And their son was severely burned in a fire. He had been in the hospital a few weeks, and there was concern that he wasn't going to make it. He just kind of lost his will to live. And then Donald shows up, not knowing any of this, plays Old MacDonald on the guitar, and apparently it brightened him up and turned around. I actually saved somebody's life. Now, if I hadn't contracted polio in the first place, none of that would have ever happened. And, you know, I just humbly kind of revel in that, say that, wow, I was responsible for saving somebody's life. So we got plenty of time here. So, all right, we'll move on from that. I graduated college. I got a job, which was also in the helping profession, as it turned out. I became a Nassau County probation officer, and I worked with juveniles. And I did that. I was going to do that for a year or two. Way back then, I had a lot more hair and a lot fuller beard. And I was going to work for a year or two, and then I was going to go down to Florida, and then I was going to go to Texas, and then to California. All these plans. Well, 33 years later, I retired from the probation job. At that point, I had been married, divorced, remarried, a couple of houses. My first marriage was pretty much a disaster. And I don't like sounding like the typical divorced father and husband saying my wife was this, that, and the other thing. She happened to be this, that, and the other thing. But I was no angel myself. I really wasn't. You know, and in fact, at that time of my life, there was drinking going on. There was smoking pot going on. We were married for about 6, 7 years and got divorced in the mid-'70s. The marriage created 2 children, 2 sons, Danny and Matt. Danny was named after one of my first cousins, who was my best friend, and when he was 21 years of age, he was killed in a motorcycle accident. That was my first experience with losing somebody very close to me, and I was shook up for a year or more. I mean, it really took a long time. So after the divorce, we split up. I didn't have full custody. They went to mom, but I did have the kids regularly, saw them a lot. Thought we had a good relationship. And then when Danny turned about 14 years of age, there were obvious signs that he was abusing drugs. And I was a real shithead because I was just in denial about it. I was frightened by it. I didn't know how to handle it. And I worked in the probation department, as I said, with juveniles. And my current wife also worked in probation, and she had contacts with the local police, and they were telling her stuff about my son Danny. And I'm like, nah, I can't be one of those deals, all right? So this went on for a couple of years. The drug involvement got worse. He became very hostile. I didn't really have any kind of relationship with him. And because of his usage of drugs and his addiction, he assaulted somebody and was going to do some serious time in jail. He was 18. As it turned out, he was sentenced to a split sentence, 6 months in jail, and then 3 years or 5 years probation. At that point, I was preparing for when he was released from jail, and he was sent upstate to a residential drug program for 6 months. This particular program, and we don't mention other programs in Al-Anon, but in addition to providing therapy for my son, had something, a family association, very similar to what we do in Al-Anon, a support group for the parents. I got involved with that immediately. His mom came for a couple weeks, and then we didn't see her anymore. After 6 months, he was released. He went back to his mom's house. One well, I'm jumping ahead, actually. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. When he was released from jail and sent upstate for 6 months, my current wife, who was jokingly referred to as the WSM, the wicked stepmother, because she was anything but that. We went up to see Danny. This would be about 5 weeks after he was placed upstate. And it was like, wow, what'd you guys do to my son? In just 6 weeks, he was more open, he was honest, he was caring. Prior to that, he was your typical drug addict. I didn't do it, it's not my fault, you made me do it, whatever. Just didn't take responsibility for anything. It was horrible. And then we went up and saw him 6 weeks after he was upstate. And a totally different boy. So I could started to rebuild a relationship with him. Wasn't happy about him going home to his mom's house, but that, his choice was, I want to live with Mom. 9 months later, I was over a friend's house, my brother and myself, watching a giant football game, and got a phone call. It turned out that Danny had overdosed on heroin the night before, and he was gone. It came as a total shock because he was doing so well, in my contact with him and at the program, when I was going to the program for the parents and he was in his own treatment. And it was like, no, this didn't happen, Well, it did happen, obviously. And a couple weeks later, my wife and I went in to see the director of the program that he and I were both in, a recovering drug addict and one of the most amazing people I'd ever met. And she ran the program. And I said, what happened? Danny was like doing so well. And she said something I'll never forget, which was, you can't go into the mind of an addict. You'll just get lost in there. And I had to accept that. And the other point I wanted to make in terms of my dealing with crises and crap stuff that happens, and this was the worst thing that could happen to anybody, obviously. When Danny died, I went to the library and took out about 5 books on the loss of a child, and I must have skimmed through all of them quickly. One I kept, the other 4 went back to the library, and in the one chapter of this book on losing a child, it says, in order to get through the pain, you have to feel the pain. Reagan mentioned that in her talk. You can't bottle it up. And there's no way around it. You stuff it, it's going to be there. You have to just feel the pain. And so what, in my case, what that ended up being is, for the first 2 weeks, just periods of crying and feeling it and accepting, or trying to accept the fact he's gone, he's not coming back, you're not going to see him again. And then gradually over time, and I liken it to, when you get a severe wound and that wound heals, but you always have a scar. This cross here is something that I've worn since Danny died. And it's on me, it's a memento. Having said all that, now I'm going to sound a little bit crazy, because Danny's life and death totally changed my life. At that point in time, I have a distinct recollection. One day, me and 2 coworkers were out at lunch. It was a nice day, sitting in the park eating, and I was listening to the one coworker talk, and 10 years older than I am at the time, so maybe 40 and 50, and there was so many things going on in his life, and he was so into stuff, and I just felt like I kind of hit a plateau, and nothing was going on. And then my higher power decided, okay, maybe, I don't know, but my son dies. I go through all that feeling, the group that I was attending, the family association, I went for about 2 or 3 weeks after his death, and then I'm like, what am I doing in this group? I don't even have a son anymore. So I stopped going to that. And about a year later, I can't tell you why, I can't remember specifically, but I missed that group. And they would meet on a Tuesday night. There'd be about 100 people, more or less. We'd have a big mass meeting, and then we'd break up into individual 10, 12 groups with, half a dozen, 8, 10 people in a group. I hadn't been there for a year. I came in, I walked in the door, and it was like the response I got, Donald, you're back. It's so good to see you. It was just hugs, and it was amazing. So I stayed until we moved out here to Arizona in 2013. I stayed with that group. I became a go-to person in that group because it was a group dealing with drug-addicted teenagers. There was always somebody, unfortunately, ODing. Somebody would die. And I became the go-to guy to share my experience with them, give them my support, tell them to feel their feelings. I got involved with public speaking, going out, and one of the big events was, it was prom time for the high school kids in the spring, and I spoke to the entire junior class and then the entire senior class about the dangers of drug abuse. And I opened up my speech there saying on October 3rd, 1999, my son died of a drug overdose. And in the front row, there were 2 or 3 girls there, juniors, and they started crying. And I went, wow, this is important what I'm doing. This is a good thing. That was a gift I received from Danny. A costly gift, obviously, but it was a gift I received from him. And I was fortunate enough to recover from it. I went to a bereavement group about 6 months later. My wife and I went. And there were people in there that 2, 3 years had passed, and they were still had a raw wound. That wound hadn't healed. And, that wasn't, just, again, I thank my higher power for it, but that wasn't my experience, So it's like, and then in the meantime, I was going to this family association, and I started back in Al-Anon. I had gone somewhere back there, and it was just for a few weeks, and I didn't connect with them. And so I just went to the other group, and then I started with Al-Anon, as I say, back around 2001. Excuse me for a minute. And this time in Al-Anon, wow, man, I just hit the ground running. Oh, well, walking fast. So my Al-Anon experience, quickly, a couple of stories. We're doing good on time. All right, I went to, this is back on Long Island first, and I went to a Friday morning group. They had a babysitter, so there were young moms there that kids were being watched in the other room, a whole range of age. And where was I going with this? I was afraid this would happen sooner or later. Even though I was new to Al-Anon, it was very similar to what I was doing previously in the drug treatment program for my son. So they had their meeting was set up half an hour or an hour before, I forget which. They had a beginners group, and they also had a step meeting. I guess a half an hour, and then we all got back together for the regular meeting. And I really liked working the beginners meeting, and I had a lot of experience with that from that other program. So one day, I had volunteered. We did 3-month stints. And I'm doing beginners, newcomers, and a newcomer comes in, and this other woman that was somewhat in the periphery. Sometimes she'd show up for groups. She wasn't a regular, but she'd come, and in my humble, non-judgmental opinion, she was a little off. You know, the elevator didn't go quite up to the top, and I'm like, oh man, this is not good. And I didn't say anything, obviously, at the time, but I'm listening to it, talking to this newcomer and going, oy, oy, oy. So we get in the regular meeting, a large group, about 25, 30 of us, and we go around, and the newcomer gets to share, and you know where this is headed. She said, oh, Shirley, or whoever it was, the things she told me in the beginners group was so good, so inspirational. I'm like, well, what about, no, I didn't say what about me, but it was a humbling experience, though. I realized I am not the wherewithal and the know-it-all with everything. And today's reading in a little place or time for me, there's a sentence in there that says something to that effect, that what I've learned in Al-Anon is I can be a responsible person for myself, but I've also learned that I don't know basically what's good for everybody else. And that's one of the beauties of the program. The other thing I wanted to say about Al-Anon, and first of all, I want to thank members from my Tuesday group and a member or two from my Saturday. I go to 2 meetings a week, for just coming and showing support. I really appreciate that. Anyway, and it happened again. Do. Damn it. I got it. Maybe I didn't want to talk about this. When I started 20 years ago, and I can look back now, another great Al-Anonism is look back but don't stare, you know. But I could look back at where I was, Donald, 20 years ago, and where Donald is today, and I can be pretty proud of myself. I can pat myself on the back. It taught me a valuable lesson in, if you don't want to be a doormat, get up off the floor, is how they put it in the books. And I used to be everybody's, not everybody's, but most people's doormat. Growing up in my family, getting back to that nice segue to get around there, my older brothers, it was an Italian family and were very forceful. And I was kind of like little Donnie, you know, and I think the polio had something to do with it. But I didn't, when I look back now, I could say I didn't have a voice. I didn't have a voice. I was overwhelmed by the big brothers. And a stark example of how I changed with that was about 4 years ago, maybe longer. Yeah, actually it was 14 years ago. Me, 2 older brothers, and a couple of close friends would go canoeing down the Delaware back in New York every summer. We'd go drive down Friday and leave on Sunday night or Monday morning and spend 2 days on the river. Now, we did drink a little beer. We were 5 guys, 6 guys canoeing down the river. But my one brother, Jim, wouldn't stop drinking beer. And then we'd get off and go, oh, I'm really drunk. I need to smoke a joint to straighten out. You know, amazing logic, you know. And he became a burden. He really became a burden. He just ruined everybody's good time and stuff like that. So now we're together, 5 of us, minus brother Jim, out having dinner a month or 2 before we're planning this year's canoe trip. And I bring it up. I said, you know, what are we going to do about Jimmy? I mean, he's just, and you know, people had spoken to him, Jim, blah, 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 and he, you know, he was an alcoholic, and he just brushed that all aside. So Yeah, well, you know, what we'll do is we'll plan the trip and we won't let him know we're going. I'm like, oh yeah, that's going to work. So I said, no, we need to confront him about this. And based on my Al-Anon experience, I was the one that was going to do it. So I said, okay, I will do it. I'd like you guys, you know, support me, whatever, if he calls you. And so I met with my brother Jim. And one of our sayings in Al-Anon is, say what you mean what you say, but don't say it mean. And I attempted that. I thought, well, I did. And obviously he took it, was in denial and said, this is bullshit. And the other guys, this is only you, Don, you know. And then he calls the other guys, and they just gave him a half-ass response. They didn't go back, no, we all think that it sucks being with you, Jim. You know, you're a pain in the ass. So in the end, what that did is it cost me a relationship with a family member, with my brother. Subsequent to that, he didn't go. We went canoeing and stuff, and I was on Jimmy's hate list or whatever list. And then I reached out a couple of times, and this is a classic one. We got together for Christmas, and I'm talking to Jimmy, and I said, why don't, you know, can't we just bury the hatchet? And he goes, yeah, we'll bury it in your back, you know, right in front of my father. I was like, wow. So basically what happened is after a few years of an occasional call here, happy birthday or something, with no response, I said, what am I doing? You know, what am I doing? And I've written him off. Now, I pray for him, hope that someday maybe, you know, he'll hit bottom, get sober, but didn't have a false relationship with him. You know, I was being honest with myself and what it was like dealing with him. And I've severed a couple of, it's interesting that Reagan mentioned that in her talk. I've severed a couple of relationships with friends that I've had too, because I realized, you know, it just wasn't right. And the relationships that I do have, I think have gotten healthier because of that, because of this program. So I'm going to wrap things up. I don't know whether, and I don't know, John, if it's appropriate or not, if somebody had a question. If anybody had a question. Otherwise, I'm just going to tie things together, again, by saying that Al-Anon is now, it's a program that a few of us like to say that we'll never graduate from. Whether or not the alcoholics in our life or drug addicts in our life are no longer in there, I'm still going. And the people in the room that are familiar with Al-Anon know this, that there's not a week that goes by that where I go to a meeting, hear something new, or just feel better than when I walked in. It's such a powerful thing. And where else can you go with a problem that thrives on secrecy, on denial, on in the dark, you know, shame and guilt? All these things are equated with Al-Anon and affect the person that loves the alcoholic. And in Al-Anon, we can go in and talk about all those things. And when you first go, like me, maybe you're not too game about talking about these things, and then you hear the person sitting next to you or across the room sharing exactly what I'm feeling. And that's, you know, there's an expression from the other program which is so appropriate to this one, which says, only you can do it, but you can't do it alone. And that's the magic of the group of Al-Anon, and I thank you very much for giving me the time to share. Thank you.